The first time Syra Nadine Qureshi saw the research vessel Argo 7, she thought of a sleeping animal that had forgotten how to breathe. The hull sat high on stale tide, its paint flensed by salt and sun until only islands of navy remained, each bordered in rust like dried blood. The shipyard air smelled of diesel ghosts and wet iron, and the gulls heckled as if the whole scene were a joke she didn't yet understand. Syra slid her palm across a dented stanchion and felt the grain of corrosion like sand under skin. She imagined the currents the old ship had cut through for years, then imagined what else had been sliced and lost beneath it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. They called it a bargain, the way men call a storm a breeze when it blows their way. Syra won the vessel at a municipal auction, unclaimed, lien strangled, and too specialized for anyone who wanted fast returns. The yard manager's eyebrows had gone up at her wire transfer and higher when she introduced herself as the sole owner, crew of one. She could feel the skepticism around her, a weather system composed of glances and muttered jokes, but she had a lifetime of practice stepping into rooms that underestimated her. She had rebuilt engines because the men who should have paid her insisted a woman could not. She'd shown them pistons polished to a mirror and blocks honed to a smoother truth. She had stood on scaffolds under other people's boats and pointed out hairline fractures only her eyes caught. And each time she descended the ladder, grease on her knuckles like a catechism, she'd tell herself, one day I'll step onto a deck that answers only to me. This was that day. And if the Argo 7 looked like a ruin, then it was a ruin with bones she could memorize. The main deck was a scatter of winches and a tired A-frame for over-the-side work. A rust-seized CTD rosette lay strapped like a wounded carousel, its bottles clouded with old ocean. A davit cried in her hand when she tested the swing. Along the starboard rail, a row of empty ROV cradles made her stomach click with possibility. The ship had been designed to listen to the deep and to pull secrets from it. Syra had not yet decided which one she wanted more, to listen, or to pull. Down in the engine room, heat still lived in the silence, trapped in old paint and memory. She ducked past handrails scarred by the work of men she'd never meet. Two main diesels crouched beneath, each mammoth-ribbed block wearing its own patina of sweat, salt and time. She pressed her ear to one and imagined the crankshaft like a cathedral bell, hearing, even now, the echo of motion. The generator base sat aft, 3 units in a row, rubber feet stiff as fists. She flicked a penlight over the fuel manifold. Someone had drained the lines before the final layup. That was either mercy or malice. She promised the ship that she would know which. The wheelhouse was a reliquary of a lost career. Paper charts lay curled like dry leaves beneath the chart table glass. A brass alidade watched the horizon with blind patience. The windscreen was a collage of brittle stickers, university crests, an expedition patch with an icebreaker, a triangle of faded tape where a photograph had once been. She touched that ghost rectangle with 2 fingers and tried to taste the shape of the absence. The NAV console was powered off. It would remain so until she could open every panel and see what the power would touch. A ship, the kind that does more than ferry men from one shore to the other, is a ledger of decisions. Syra walked the Argo 7 with a mechanic's gaze and a pilgrim's quiet, writing those decisions in her head. There had been money here once, and hunger for answers to questions that required steel to ask them. There had also been retreat, temporary patches where there should have been replacements, labels peeled off instead of rewritten, a piece of deck plate that flexed under her heel where a nerve had fallen silent. She found the first message in the galley. It was nothing dramatic, just a shipboard bulletin sticky taped to a cabinet above the coffee machine, printed on paper that had aged the way bread does, yellowing at the edges, gone stale in the center. The title line read, in a font that tried too hard to be friendly, "Safety is a team sport." Under it, a paragraph about spill procedures. 3 paragraphs down, a single sentence that halted her. Samples in freezer 3 to remain secured until legal clearance. She read it twice, then again, tasting every word. Samples. Freezer 3. Secured. Legal clearance. The word samples meant something special aboard a research vessel. The wrong kind meant a lawsuit that never slept. The right kind meant a discovery that slept only in other people's envy. "Where are you?" she asked the empty galley, and something in the fluorescent light answered with a flicker. She found the freezers below decks, forward of the wet lab. Freezer 1 and Freezer 2 were industrial chest units, each dressed in frost like a coat from someone else's winter. Freezer 3 sat apart, bolted to the deck with L-brackets, cables snaking into conduit that disappeared into the bulkhead. It had a keypad on the latch. "Hello," Syra murmured, her breath making a small cloud in the cold air. She brushed the pad with the back of her knuckles. The plastic was clean. Too clean for a ship that had gone to seed. Someone had come back to wipe away fingerprints, or to leave none. She felt a smile, sharp as a spark, lift the corner of her mouth. The keypad didn't flash when she touched it. It didn't do anything at all. That meant it was either dead or listening in a way she couldn't see. Syra followed the cable into the bulkhead. The conduit led aft toward a locked utility closet. She bent to the padlock the way a violinist bends to an E string, and in the silence, she could hear the alloys tell their truth to the pick. The shackle surrendered with a soft gasp. The closet housed a small UPS on a floating shelf, a steel junction box, and a bank of batteries wired in series parallel with cables thick enough to strangle an animal. A label maker, someone had believed in order, had printed, Freezer 3, isolated power. Syra felt the hair on her arms rise the way it did when she was about to find a bolt whose threads were clean after years of neglect. Isolated power meant the freezer would live even if the rest of the ship died. It meant someone had wanted one box, and only one, to survive. She traced the wires and found a failover switch and, above it, a small industrial-grade cellular modem, no ship's Wi-Fi here, wired to a stub of antenna hidden in the fat throat of a ventilation duct. The modem wore a SIM card like a secret tooth. The light on it was dark. It had slept a long time. Syra stood very still in that closet and felt the ship incline toward her, like it too had been holding its breath. Whoever had built this wanted to keep Freezer 3 alive through blackout, through desertion, through the humility of being sold for scrap. Whoever had built this wanted to be able to find out, from shore, whether Freezer 3 was still alive. She closed the closet gently and returned to the wet lab. The benches were clean, stripped of glassware and reagents, taped with labels that had grown pale enough to be their own ghosts. A whiteboard hung to the left of the fume hood. Someone had cleaned it poorly. Under a film of half-hearted erasure, notes winked through in the right light, numbers, arrows, a smiley face with shark teeth and the words "Good luck, idiots." Her throat tightened. She had learned to tell the difference between the mess people leave when they mean to return and the mess they leave when they are running. This had the panic of a departure with 2 dogs barking in one suitcase. She took photographs, angles, distances, the exact grain of dust patterns around the freezer's feet. She sent them to a folder on her phone labeled breadcrumbs. She had learned to investigate her own life in case other people bathed it in doubt. The ship needed power. She spent the next day and night coaxing the generator bay back toward a heartbeat. She cleaned the fuel lines with a tenderness that would have embarrassed her if anyone were watching. She pulled injectors and held them like needles between finger and thumb. She replaced what time had unthreaded. When at last she primed the system and thumbed the starter, the generator coughed like an old smoker waking to news, then it steadied. The hum filled her bones. Syra smiled without showing her teeth. She brought the NAV bus up in the wheelhouse in the order that did no harm. She brought lights back to the labs. She let the galley breathe. When she finally stood again in front of Freezer 3, the keypad glowed a soft, patient green. No one ever really leaves, she told it, and reached for the keys. There was no weak guess to try. No birthday would open this. No predictable 4-digit sin. She had tried those kinds of locks in the world where men argued over invoices and values like parlor games. This keypad belonged to a world where the thing inside could ruin reputations for the price of a melted plug. She turned away, intending patience, and found instead a note. It was taped, old ship tape, the kind that leaves a brown square of memory when peeled, behind the freezer, just where the air currents caught nothing. A folded page, grease-stiff and careful. She pried it free. On it, a hand that squeezed the ink too hard had written, "If you're reading this, the board cut funding. We locked the vault for legal reasons. Don't power the ship with shore supply. Make your own. The kill circuit is on the pier. L. Vault." Syra let the word melt in her mouth. Not the freezer, then, or not only. She remembered the slight springiness in the deck plate near the aft lab. She went back there now, knelt, and pressed. The metal flexed with the loose tight sigh of a lid disguised as floor. She chased fasteners with a nut driver and found 4 that were new metal in old holes. The plate lifted by an inch, then 2, and swung back with a complaint, revealing a narrow shaft lit by the kind of light you install in a hurry and hope you never need. A ladder dropped into a compartment that the ship plans, if she'd had them, would pretend not to know. Syra climbed down. The walls of the vault were insulated with foam panels wrapped in aluminum, cold-minded. The air smelled like the inside of a brand-new battery. At shoulder height, a bank of Pelican cases waited, each strapped to a shelf with a ratchet buckle and tagged with barcodes that had been kissed by salt but hadn't blurred. On the opposite side, a stainless steel rack held 4 long, torpedo-nosed cylinders and padded saddles. Their titanium skins were bead-blasted matte. The embossed letters near the nose cones made her chest hollow out, AUVPLN-42 Lotus. Autonomous underwater vehicles. Compact, probably 1.8 meters nose to tail, fins folded for storage. She'd slept on benches to dream of machines like these. On the rack below them, each cradle held a silver-gray container the size of her forearm, with connectors that looked like they wanted to be touched by gentle thumbs. She unclipped one Pelican case and lifted it onto a work shelf. The latches fought her in that old way, then surrendered. Inside lay a squat, armored computer the color of battleship Twilight, its face bristling with ports and an LED display the size of an eye. A label in the same hand as the note, L, again, read, Core. She didn't exhale for a few seconds, then she did it all at once, a laugh lost in the small room. The ship was not just a relic. It was a chrysalis. Someone had left it mid-molt and prayed the cocoon would hold. Syra checked the AUVs. Their pressure housings were clean. Their seals had been oiled before abandonment with a thoroughness approaching love. Each nosecone housing bore a small, hardened window that would sit in front of a low-light camera or a laser line scanner. Each belly mount offered modularity, swappable payloads. She found one payload in a foam cutout, a compact multi-beam sonar head small enough to make big companies jealous. She thought she understood some of what had happened. An oceanographic team had developed a swarm tool, a handful of small AUVs that could be deployed from any deck with a crane, flown below thermocline like a flock, and knit high-resolution maps together without having to lift a second mortgage to pay a survey firm. If you could tackle licensing in the right areas, you could map continental shelf creases where the ocean had drawn outlines around things humans didn't like to leave alone: gas hydrates, rare earth nodules, old cables with new secrets. Under the Pelican case labeled Core, she found an envelope. Not a metaphorical envelope, a physical one, thick and water-resistant. Inside were keys, a laminated card with a 12-digit alphanumeric string printed on it, and a sticker that said, "If the lights go red, you've got 60 seconds." She sat back on her heels and listened to her own heart, counting, to make sure it belonged to her. There are kinds of value in the world that don't act like money until someone makes a phone call. Syra could feel the weight of that phone call in the room with her, like a 7th Pelican case. You could show a bank manager a gold bar and he'd lick his lips. You could show him a dataset that could accelerate subsea exploration by 5 years and he might not even know where to put it on a ledger. But there were people who would, and they wore shoes that cut quiet lines into carpet and smiled like curtains closing. Back on deck, the sky had the indifference of a late afternoon that hadn't decided yet how cruel evening would be. The yard manager passed below with a clipboard and an air of someone who wanted to look useful while avoiding any real proximity to responsibility. Syra waved, then turned to trace the conduit that the note had warned her about, the kill circuit on the pier. At the shore power pedestal, she found the switch box by feel more than sight, a welded-on pad for a tag, a safety hasp bent in the way of hurried hands. Inside, someone had added a relay that would trip a secondary circuit if shore power was applied while the vault systems were live. That would, she exhaled slowly, likely dump current into a resistor bank designed to create a heat event on the freezer's control board. If the freezer went above a critical threshold, it would assume breach and command the AUV bay to wet disconnect everything with prejudice. A self-destruct, but tidy, the kind a lawyer could argue was safety first. Not today, Syra told the switch and closed the box. At midnight, alone on her ship with generators purring like cats that had met God, she powered the core. The armored computer booted to a monochrome interface that made her think of the first cell phone she'd owned, a Nokia she had loved like a coin. A menu blossomed where the word blossomed felt like a joke: payload status / vehicle health / mission profiles / data vault. She selected payload status. The screen printed out numbers as if it had been waiting years to stretch its legs and make ink again. All green. She went to vehicle health and read with the ritual obedience of a pilot running pre-flight. All green except one battery whose cycle count suggested a summer too long in storage. She marked it for love later. When she went to Data Vault, the screen asked for the 12-digit code. Syra took the laminated card from her pocket. She read the numbers once, then again, because excitement has a way of moving digits around like a magician. She typed with slow hands. She hit enter. For an instant, the world held its breath. Then the ship breathed with it. The LED went red. A thin line of text appeared, almost a whisper at the bottom of the screen: authentication handshake, remote check required. Remote, she repeated, softly. The modem in the closet, the antenna throat in the vent, of course. The vault wanted to ask the shore if it was loved. She had choices. She could snip wires and force the vault open, the sort of violence that leaves scars in software. Or she could let the ship talk to whatever server still believed in it. The latter risked an answer, and answers attract their own weather. She stood in the artery quiet of the lab and waited. She remembered how being underestimated had taught her to use the truth sparingly. But this was the opposite. This was showing her throat to an animal to prove she wasn't prey. Syra powered the modem. A little green diode licked on like a tongue. In the next 30 seconds, a conversation occurred between a rusting ship and an unseen room somewhere with air conditioning the temperature of expensive glass. The modem found a network. The modem introduced itself. The server said, "Who are you?" The modem replied with a SIM number that had been sleeping in a drawer of a lab that probably didn't exist anymore. The server then asked for the ship's soul. The ship answered with a checksum only a friend would know. The LED went white. The screen said, "Handshake successful." Unseal? Y/N. Syra's thumb hovered. Far off, down the pier, a car door shut. She froze and listened the way a mechanic listens to a bearing for the first complaint of a ruin. Footsteps. Slow. 2 people, maybe 3, one heavy, one lighter, one whose weight distribution suggested a weapon worn daily. She could hear it in the way the footfall compensated. She killed the overhead lights out of pure animal decision and let her pupils drink the dark. The core's display became a little moon in the vault. Her ship breathed. The generators muttered their prayers. The freezer hummed a note in a register she could name in her sleep. She climbed up into the lab and looked through the porthole. The yard's floodlamps put everyone in shadow, but she saw the silhouettes: 2 men, 1 woman, all in clothes that made organized people feel normal. The woman's hair was tied in a bun that had decided to quit an hour ago. They carried nothing obvious. They looked the way trouble looks when it believes it has paperwork. "Evening," called the heavy man when he came into the circle of light below the gangway. He had the voice of someone whose throat had grown a scar from cheap cigarettes and more expensive lies. "We're from Oceanic Asset Recovery. Just a quick inspection while you've got her powered." The yard manager said it was fine. Syra breathed once and let the breath go. She leaned over the rail. "The yard manager doesn't own this ship. We're not here to cause trouble." His smile climbed, failed, tried again. We're here to make sure you don't run into a legal issue. The vessel is subject to a lien from a university partner. There's a standing injunction against tampering with certain equipment. Tampering. Standing. Injunction. The words clicked into the same machine that had produced legal clearance. She thought of the modem connected now to the internet like a second spine. She imagined a server waking like a crocodile to an oar in its sleeping water. Come back tomorrow, she said, and she made tomorrow sound like the end of a long road. I'm afraid we can't. He smiled again. There's a safety risk. What kind of risk? The kind that gets us sued if we don't stop it tonight. Syra scanned the deck with the shorthand of a person who has worked in tight places with bad choices. Her right hand had already found the collapsible batten she kept by the ladder. Her left hand rested on the steel of the rail where the paint had been rubbed thin by hands that had not belonged to her but knew the shape of her thumb. Wait there, she said, and stepped back, making her feet say that she was going to get paperwork of her own. She did not go for paperwork. She went for the vault. At the core, the prompt waited like a held breath, unseal? Y/N. The modem's diode was a tiny green star. If she opened the vault now and the freezer contained anything that wanted to count time, she might start a clock. If she left it, the people below might have their own key, their own remote number, their own way of unsealing this without asking her. Syra pressed Y. The ship made a sound like a remembered vow. Somewhere in the bulkhead, a relay tripped. The freezer's latch clicked in a way that had nothing to do with food. The deck under her feet seemed to notch into the world differently. She opened freezer 3. Cold blossomed around her wrists like a blessing that had learned to bite. Inside, vacuum-sealed cassettes lay in a grid, each printed with a code and the unmistakable silhouette of organisms that did not belong in any home freezer. Not fish. Not squid. Something like coral but finer, a lacework that looked like someone had knitted glass. She swallowed a curse that would have felt too small. She knew what some of these were. Not species, but category, microarchitectures grown in supercritical conditions, the kind biotech firms whispered about when they were trying to invent bones that didn't break in filters that could drink poison. The cassettes themselves were expensive enough to buy a new car with 3. But the data printed onto the labels, the growth parameters, the site coordinates, were the sort of lines of ink that could move 9 figures. Footsteps hit the gangway. "Ma'am," called the heavy man, voice tightening in surprise and something like irritation boiling under it, "we need you to secure all equipment and step aside." "Almost done," Syra sang without beauty and with all the confidence it takes to not give away that your hands are shaking. She slid one cassette into a foam-lined cradle on the workbench. She took photographs like a thief and a priest, for the record, for the absolution she would later require of herself. The woman reached the top of the gangway first. She moved with the wary poise of a person who had been taught in a class what to do if a situation became what the class called kinetic. Her eyes flicked. Her right hand hovered. Syra kept her baton at her thigh, invisible in the way a shadow is when it's exactly where it belongs. "Turn the power off," the woman said. "Now." "If I do," Syra replied, her voice calm as an unspooled rope, "the systems will assume a breach and destroy what you're here to preserve." That landed like a thrown glass. The woman's eyes flinched toward the closet where the modem hummed. The heavy man came up behind her, breathing like someone who had never made peace with stairs. "Ms. Qureshi," the heavy man said, choosing formality the way gamblers choose purple chips when they want to look rich, "there are legal implications you don't understand." Syra almost laughed. "There always are." She lifted the cassette and set it back into the freezer with the care one gives to a sleeping child. "Tell me who you work for." He hesitated for a hair of a second, and in that second Syra knew he worked for a law firm with a naming convention like a firm handshake, 3 names, 1 ampersand, all of it carved into glass on the 30th floor of a building that had opinions about carpets. He smiled again the way a dog shows its teeth by accident. "We represent interested parties." "Which ones?" she asked, and in the asking, she glanced at the core. The LED had gone pink. The pink looked like the inside of a mouth. The screen printed new text in a font that could not decide if it was COM, Vault Data Link, Live. Remote mirror, active. Time TO lock, 60s. Syra felt her skin narrow around her. The modem had called home, and home had started copying. She imagined an office filled with the sound of server fans. She imagined someone in a suit leaning over a screen and saying, "We've got it. Pull it all. Pull it now." She imagined them trying to own her seconds. The woman took one step closer. Her breath smelled like mint gum and coffee in a job she had convinced herself was only about process. "Ma'am," she said, "step away." Syra reached for the laminated card. She liked the weight it put into the world. She liked being the person who chose whether the seconds belonged to a server in a cold room or to the hands that had repaired the ship. On the screen, the number read 55s. She walked to the closet and pulled the modem's plug. The screen in the vault went from pink to red so quickly it was like watching a bruise find itself. A flat tone entered the room and did not ask permission to stay. The core printed, "Mirror interrupted. Security response, engaged. Purge if no confirmation, 60. 59. The heavy man swore in a voice that wasn't meant for customer service. The woman's hand shifted. Syra was already moving, the baton in her right hand blooming into existence like a fact. She did not swing it. She pointed with it, precisely, like a mechanic indicating a bearing you should not touch if you want to sleep 10 more years. "Everyone stop," she said. "The system thinks we're thieves. If we don't convince it we're not in under a minute, it will melt its own memory." She saw a calculation move behind the woman's eyes like weather over water. The heavy man looked at the core, as if he could intimidate a computer into obedience. The third figure stepped onto the deck then, the lighter one she'd heard below. He was younger, leaner, the kind whose suits always looked as if the hanger still occupied the shoulders. His face was careful, but his shoes betrayed him, sole scuffs in a pattern that said he walked courthouse steps often. "Ms. Qureshi," he said gently, "my name is Lev Strauss. We represent the estate of Dr. Laleh Moradi." The name reached Syra like a tide and pulled at something in her chest she hadn't realized was there. She'd spent nights reading papers during insomnia born of engines. She knew Moradi's name. Weave carbon in a lattice under pressure, teach the weave to remember a shape, then ask it to learn a different one. Bones that flex and return. Membranes that filter arsenic but let life through. Laleh Moradi was what the industry called a moonshot with the smile of a human being who remembered wanting to solve water before money learned how to spell it. "Dr. Moradi is dead," Syra said softly, knowing it even as she asked, a kind of test she hated giving the world. Lev's eyes flickered, a funeral in miniature. "Plane crash. 2 months ago." The purge clock read 37s. "We need you to authorize the mirror," he said. "If what you've found is what we think, the estate has obligations. Grants, partnerships. The data can't sit and appear overnight. It has to be secured." "And then what?" Syra asked. "You'll come back with a court order tomorrow and take the rest? If that's what the law requires." His tone was sincere enough to break a tooth on. The purge clock read 31s. The room seemed to tighten, the way a car does when you take an off-ramp too fast and the weight insists you respect it. Syra thought of what the yard manager called her when he thought she couldn't hear, "that girl." She thought of how many times men had told her that what she was doing was fine until it wasn't. She thought of the ship, of the AUVs that had slept like bright knives, of Dr. Moradi's name and how it had the shape of someone who left things in better repair. She turned to the core and stabbed enter. "Confirm mirror authorization." Y/N. She reached for Y. Her thumb paused. The woman's hand was still at her side, but her weight had shifted, readying. Lev's face, steady as a courtroom. The heavy man's breath, a saw through a knot. Syra chose N. The tone in the room changed timbre, better and worse all at once. The screen printed, "Mirror denied. Local access only. Purge if unsealed, 20. 19. Ms. Qureshi. Lev's voice cracked, the kind of break a careful man hates to hear coming from his own throat. You don't understand what you're about to do. I understand exactly, she said. If this data leaves with you, it never returns to the ocean that made it. It goes to rooms where water is a budget line. Lev lifted his hands, palms open. We can negotiate tomorrow. Tonight, the priority is to preserve. If the purge completes, you destroy the estate's assets and expose yourself to criminal liability for spoliation. Criminal liability. The words sounded like tools used wrong. The purge clock read 12. Syra turned, grabbed the first of the AUVs, and hauled it from its rack onto the deck. She moved like someone whose mind had reached a decision and devoted the body to it without asking. She slapped the quick-release connectors onto the core, 1, 2, 3, and spoke to the ship like a friend who would not abandon her. Mission profile, 1. Home, pier. Splash, moon pool. The ship answered in relays like fingers remembering how to play. The moon pool hatch coughed. The hydraulics, rusty and groaning, opened the door that had not been asked to taste ocean in 2 years. Cold air rose like a promise from below. Stop, the woman said, and Syra did not. She shoved the AUV over the lip and it dropped into its element with a sound that hurt and healed her at the same time. The core's screen printed, Vehicle 1, online. Link good. Awaiting orders. The purge clock read 7. Syra looked at Leviticus. You want preservation, she said. Help me keep them alive in the water. That's where they belong. Decide in the morning who owns the future. Lev hesitated for the length of one human doubt. The heavy man cursed again and reached forward. Syra's baton flicked, a small motion that found Knuckles. He yelped, more insult than injury. Syra looked back to the core. She selected Data Vault, selected Export Local, selected AUV Payload. The screen printed, encrypted dumps ready. Schedule? She stabbed now. The purge clock read 3. A siren she hadn't known the ship possessed breathed in behind the tone and then found a voice. Security purge imminent. The freezer's compressor changed note. The core's fan spooled to a pitch that made her teeth remember childhood drill visits. Lev took a step toward her and stopped, because something in Syra's eyes told him the next step would change not just the night but the way he thought about himself when he tried to sleep later. The purge clock read 2. From the open maw of the moon pool, water reflected the lab lights in a grid that looked like a map of a city. The purge clock read 1. On the wall above the core, a mechanical relay, forgotten by everyone who had ever sworn they knew every wire on the ship, clicked down into place, engaging a circuit no one had seen fit to label. The screen jittered once. The siren swallowed its own voice and then coughed it back out, angrier. The purge clock read 0. And a line of text appeared on the screen that was not in the manual, not on the laminated card, not in the words of anyone who had ever worked on this ship. It printed itself with the calm of catastrophe. Scuttling sequence armed, 059. Scuttling sequence armed, 059. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The numbers on the core marched like soldiers who had been told their orders by a man who disliked doubt. 058. Syra's mouth was suddenly desert dry. She reached for the emergency stop on instinct and stopped herself a breath short. A true scuttle didn't honor stop buttons, it honored redundancy. Somewhere, relays were making decisions in steel. Who armed that? The heavy man barked, his bluster cracking under the pitch of the siren. Not me, Syra said, and the ship seemed to nod, as if ashamed and proud at once. Lev's eyes moved the way a lawyer's eyes move when time becomes an animal in the room. It's a failed dead man. If the vault believes hostile access and mirror denial, it assumes seizure. It sinks itself rather than let a court fight decide ownership. Dr. Murati would never. The woman cut herself off, jaw tight. There has to be a bypass. 052. Syra was already moving. She threw the second AUV onto the cradle and clicked the connectors home. Vehicle 2, she said, fingers on keys, you're a courier now. Accept payload and go to standby. The core answered, Vehicle 2, online. Ms. Qureshi, Lev said, voice low, urgent, tell me what you need. I need 10 more minutes, she said, and the cruel kindness of the countdown answered her with 049. She knelt at the open junction box beside the core, eyes drinking copper like a scripture. There, the unlabeled relay that had clicked when 0 arrived. It fed a ladder of logic blocks tied to 2 places she didn't like, the sea chest valves and the engine room bilge pumps. A scuttle by opening the ocean to the hull's hollow and making sure the water stayed. Can you kill it? The heavy man asked, hope like a stain he didn't admit to. Not without triggering the second, Cyrus said. There's always a second. She popped the relay free with a screwdriver held like a scalpel and flashed the backplane. 2 tiny dip switches gleamed like bad teeth. She toggled the first, then the second. The siren pitch didn't change. On the core, scuttling, primary. 044. Cyrus' mind did a thing she had trained it to do since girlhood, dive beneath panic and grab a wrench by feel. The scuttling logic was nested. Primary triggered by purge and mirror denial. Secondary by the absence of primary, a watchdog against tampering. The only path was to route the primary somewhere it could. She looked up at the moon pool. Water, obedient as an old dog, waited below. Lev, she said, if I open the sea chests, I can make the scuttle true but in a place I can control. The moon pool can take surge if I gate it slowly. The pumps will try to help me flood. I need you to watch bilge levels and shout the second they go past frame 3. Lev nodded once, already moving to the panel. The woman, eyes galvanized by a decision, slipped into the engine corridor. Show me your sea chest valves, she called, and Cyrus' chest did that contradictory thing the human body does in danger when a stranger chooses to help. 040. The heavy man hovered useless as a storm cloud. Stand by the emergency shore quick disconnect, Cyrus snapped. If anything arcs, you pull the handle and pray. He went. Cyrus sprinted to the manual valve levers near the moon pool. The handles were stiff with neglect. She threw her weight onto the first and felt it turn like a shoulder coming out of a socket, then home. Water bloomed through the throat of the ship, swelling into the moon pool with an eagerness that made her feel both terrified and strangely tender. She cracked the second, gating it a quarter. 035. Bilge is rising, Lev called. Frame 1 nominal. Frame 2 climbing. Syra moved back to the core. Vehicle 2, she said, accept dump. The screen printed, payload right, 8%. The freezer hummed, implacable. The cassettes gleamed under lab light like the bones of some glass animal. Sea chests open, the woman shouted from below. But there's a second manifold tagged auxiliary. It's wired into the same logic. It'll flood aft compartments if primary doesn't rise fast enough. Cyrus' eyes cut to the diagram on the bulkhead. An auxiliary manifold meant someone had once planned to sink the ship in layers if necessary. Is there a manual override? Someone epoxied it shut. She swore. Bastards. 029. Frame 2 approaching red, Lev warned. Frame 3 ready. Syra opened the moon pool fully. Water came up like a hand. It reached the lip and stopped there, lapping with a tongue that tasted like metal and old experiments. The ship settled almost imperceptibly, an animal adjusting to a new weight in its gut. Frame 2 holding, Lev said, exhale audible. Good, Syra said through her teeth. Vehicle 2? Payload right, 27%. Come on, she whispered. The AUV's small status LED swinked, impersonal and faithful. The heavy man peered around the lab door. We're not all going down with this tub, are we? Not tonight, Cyrus said. Do you know how to tie a bowline? He blinked. A what? She pointed to the strap securing the core. If the ship starts to roll, we'll want it married to the bench like it was born there. He fumbled a knot that wasn't a bowline and then managed something that would hold if the universe was feeling generous. Syra left it be. Sometimes generosity arrived disguised as clumsiness. 022. A deep clunk sounded beneath them. The woman's voice came back thinner, echoing through steel. Auxiliary manifold opening. It's on a motorized actuator. No override topside. If it floods aft, the generator bay goes first. Lights dimmed a fraction, like a sigh. Syra's brain drew a line with a pencil she did not have time to sharpen. Auxiliary flooding on a timer, meant to ensure death by drowning rather than infection by lawyers. Can you reach it? She shouted. Not without getting my arm crushed. Metal groaned. Syra, the woman's voice bent around the name like it had been making room for it for years. Syra stared at the core. Payload right, 49%. 018. She grabbed a pry bar, a length of rebar she'd found welded under a bench with the sarcasm, good ideas only, and vanished down the ladder. The engine corridor was a tunnel of heat and noise and the honest smell of metal waking to duty it didn't want. The woman stood at a bulkhead, sleeve rolled, fingers white around a valve handwheel that might as well have been the neck of a god. I'm Mara Keene, the woman said without looking away from the metal, as if names themselves could be tools. Formerly with Murata's team. Now, what the lawyers hired when the labs went dark. Syra braced the pry bar against the actuator housing. On 3, she said. It's going to scream. It already is, Mara said. They bore down in tandem. The actuator shrieked, high and ugly. The housing sprang a quarter inch. Syra felt something in her shoulder threaten. She set her jaw and gave it the rest. The actuator jumped teeth, stalled, and stopped like an animal suddenly remembering it was tethered. Above, the siren warbled, furious and newly thwarted. The lights steadied. 014. They ran back up, breathing like antennae. Payload right, 71%. Frame 2 stable, Lev called, voice a notch brighter. Frame 3 green. Pumps are fighting us, but the moon pool is taking the worst. Good ship, Syra said to the deck, palm on the bulkhead like a blessing. The heavy man hovered in the door again. What about me, he said, with a plaintive buoyance that made Syra want to both punch and protect him. You're doing fine, she said. What's your name? Carl. Carl, when I tell you, you're going to slam the remote quick shut on the sea chests. It'll slam the primaries and fool the watchdog into thinking we've scuttled. Then we'll trick the secondary into thinking it's done its duty by giving it a taste through the moon pool. You'll have about 2 seconds to not panic. He nodded with the gravity of someone who knows he might only actually accomplish the not panicking part. 010. Payload right, 84%. Lev hovered over the bilge panel like a rabbi at a wedding. If this works, he said in a voice trying to be triumphant and not daring it, I'll draft the most beautiful injunction you've ever seen. It will make judges cry. Make it sing, Syra said. Mara? Sea chest levers are in reach. 007. Syra's fingers hovered over the core. She selected Vehicle 2, Launch. The AUV chirped in computational delight, then slid off the cradle into the moon pool with a bakery's worth of grace. The lab lights strobed once in appreciation. Payload right, 100%. Carl, now! Carl yanked the quick shut with a noise like breaking a world in half. Under the deck, valves slammed. Water shivered. The siren hiccuped. 005. Syra keyed in a maintenance override on the watchdog ladder with a code that had never been written anywhere except the margin of a technician's notebook, something she knew because she had been that technician on other ships for other men. She flipped a toggle that forced a false positive on the secondary with a timing window as thin as a blade. 004. The siren cut off as if beheaded. The core printed, primary, success. Secondary, armed, hold. 003. The moon pool's water level shuddered, then rose half an inch and held there, quivering like a pulse restrained by fingers. 002. Syra felt the ship decide to live. 001. The countdown froze. The core hummed, emblematic, ancient, alive. Midnight. Scuttling aborted. Security state, locked local. Silence fell in the lab like a bell made of velvet. Then the generator's quiet working filled the space again, the sound of domesticated thunder. Carl sat down on a crate and put his face in his hands. "I hate boats," he said into his palms, and then, because panic has to go somewhere, he laughed. Syra leaned on the bench until her heart remembered its vocation. Across from her, Mara Keen smiled with something like relief and apology braided together. Lev Strauss exhaled a prayer that the law rarely hears. "Now what?" Mara asked, when breathing became an activity again. Syra looked at the freezer, at the cassettes that made promises nobody deserved and everybody wanted. "We keep them cold. We keep them ours. We keep the ocean in this room." "It won't be ours for long," Lev said, and there was no triumph in it. "The estate will petition the court in the morning. The university will join. Government will follow to pretend it was always theirs. Then we stay ahead," Syra said. "We put the data where no one can sell it before science uses it." "How?" Mara asked. Syra's gaze slid to the moon pool. "We trust Murata's first instinct. We put it back in the water." They worked through the night while the shipyard slept like a beast convinced of its chains. Syra and Mara drew power cables like arteries, lashing the core to the lab bench so hard the metal creaked with commitment. Lev turned his phone into a war room, texting, emailing, memorializing every action with timestamps and photos as if documentation itself could save them. Carl fretted and fetched and, when told not to touch something, touched it more gently than he had touched anything in his life. By 3:10, 2 AUVs ghosted under the pier, patient punctuation in a sentence the ocean had been writing for centuries. Syra configured them as couriers and librarians both, one to carry a full encrypted mirror of the vault into a harbor cache they keyed on a GPS coordinate both arbitrary and sacred, the latitude of Syra's mother's village, the longitude of Murata's birthplace, the other to loiter under the hull like a guard dog with a computer science degree, sniffing for intrusion signals. Mara rebuilt the freezer's power isolation with the hands of someone who had long ago stopped believing that solder was merely metal. Murati called the lattice Lotus, she said quietly, eyes on a joint. Because it grew best when the water was dirtiest. Syra blew a hair out of her eye. She named the AUVs that, too. Mara nodded. Lotus in the mud. That was her. I testified at her grand hearing. They cut the budget by a third and told her to be more realistic. A month later, she found a way to grow bone scaffolds that tricked the body into accepting implants like old friends. She's the estate Lev represents, Syra said, and then because it needed to be said aloud to be real, and she's dead. Mara's soldering iron paused in a silence small enough to hold a heart. She went to pitch a lifeline. The plane's engine ate a bird and decided the sky was over. Syra tightened the connector until it felt like hope. At 4:22, they took coffee like medicine and planned a morning built from haste and audacity. We get her out, Syra said, pointing to a paper chart spread on the lab bench, at first light. An hour outside the harbor, there's a shelf drop, 200 meters then 800 in a breath. We put the AUVs down the wall and map everything Murati flagged. If we can demonstrate field results, the court can't claim we sat on data. We're active stewards. We're messy, but righteous. You know a judge who reads poetry? Lev asked, but there was that half-smile again. I know the ocean writes it, Syra said. And I know how to show it a pen. Mara traced a finger along the chart. The coordinates Murati scribbled on the lab whiteboard, the ones someone tried to erase? They line up with a fault scar I always thought was dead. If it isn't, it's bringing minerals up from the deep trench. The Lotus loves a buffet. Hydrothermal seep without the heat, Syra said. Enough to feed engineered microstructures. Enough to paint a seafloor with a money no one wants to call money in public. Lev's phone buzzed. He glanced. His face flickered. The university filed an ex parte motion at 4 a.m. They want an emergency order to impound the vessel. He looked up, the man of words now living inside a body forced to respect the tide. Clerk doesn't get in until 8. We have a window. Then we sail at 5, Cyrus said. Dawn arrived with a gray that felt like a decision postponed. The Argo 7 slid off her lines like a woman remembering how to dance. Diesel grumble translated into thrust. The bow found the channel with a confidence that made the yard manager blink from the pier like a man seeing an ex-lover in a suit too expensive to deny. Cyrus stood at the wheel, hands gentle, eyes serious, mouth set in that line that makes other people later decide you were beautiful or terrifying. Mara monitored the core in the lab, calling numbers into a radio like incantations. AUV-1, clean. AUV-2, loyal. Freezer 3, perfect. Bilges, modestly damp. Carl, sweating. Lev? Syra asked into the handset. In position, he answered from the bow, where he stood with binoculars and a face doing math with distant shapes. Coast Guard cutter warming up off starboard. No movement yet. I think they're just curious. Curiosity keeps the world alive, Syra said. Until it doesn't. The channel widened into open water. Waves lifted the bow and set it down with a kindness that the sea grants to ships it remembers fondly. Syra opened the throttles a fraction more. The diesels responded with that rolling comfort that made mechanics feel like the world could be good if only everything had oil. They reached the shelf edge by 6:12, the sun trying to solve its own calculus behind a film of cloud. The ocean went from bottle green to deep blue over a distance you could measure in lives. Syra brought the Argo 7 into a slow, gentle circle that would keep them above the drop-off without letting the current have the wheel. Mara prepared the first AUV with hands that had said goodbye to their tremors an hour ago. Lev stood between them with the quiet dignity of a man who had found, for an hour at least, work that made sense. Lotus 1, Syra said, hand on the casing, go be a librarian. They released the vehicle into the ocean and watched it transition from clumsy land object to fluent sea being. The tetherless link engaged, the core saying ticks and numbers in tiny hallelujahs. Syra slid her eyes to the screen and saw the first returns from the multi-beam, the wall dropping away, straight like book spines, a smear of echolushness near a ledge. Life, Mara whispered, meaning not biology but the affirmative answer of matter under question. Lotus 2, Syra said, you're the writer. Paint me a map. The second AUV went over. The lab hummed. Lev leaned over the plotter with the solemn devoutness men used to give to altars. The screen grew a mosaic goalkeepers would envy for its hex order. The echo smear resolved into a patch of filigree on the shelf face, a bower knitted onto the rock, sparkling the way only data sparkles. Mara covered her mouth with her hand. Oh, Lala, she said. You did it, you magnificent, impossible woman. What am I seeing? Lev asked. A farm without farmers, Syra said quietly. A garden of lattice seated on exudates. The structure grows, self-repairs, filters and binds in patterns that look like prayer and behave like math. She tapped a key to overlay the chemical signature readouts. The numbers danced in columns. The membrane did what Moradi had promised, it drank heavy metals like after-dinner coffee and pushed out water that tasted like relief. It grabbed arsenic and whispered it into harmless geometry. It made bone like scaffolds and shapes bone loves to remember. Market impact, Lev murmured, because parts of his brain were bruised and still trying to stand. Desalination capex down 40% in 5 years, implant rejection down 2/3, rare earth extraction from brine feasible without war. His voice grew a layer of awe he had not expected to own. This isn't a paper. It's a hinge. Syra tuned Lotus 1 to skim closer. The cameras picked up subtle movements in the filigree, oscillations under the push of current. The structure fed off the seep, grew back where the ocean nipped it, and politely refrained from colonizing where the rock told it no. She plotted waypoints like a seamstress laying chalk. The map began to look like something other people would argue over for a decade. The number in her head, a floating, ugly, necessary number, the $110 million that had been a headline in her desire, stopped being money and became the count of surgeries changed, wells saved, fisheries unpoisoned, wars not fought. Mara breathed out without words. And then Lev, still on the bow, said the name that changed the morning, Coast Guard. His radio voice came soft because yelling made predators curious. Fast RIB off the cutter. 4 aboard. Closing. Syra looked up at the horizon. The gray wedge of the RIB sliced their way, its engine noise sprocketing across the water like a drill that intended to fix something by force. Time, she asked. 3 minutes, Lev said. Maybe 2 if they like speed. Lotus 1 and 2, finish your current lines and hold depth, Syra ordered. The Corps acknowledged. She pulled in a breath that smelled like metal and coffee and the kind of decision that leaves scars. We can comply, Mara said. We can show them everything. Play clean. They won't see clean, Syra said. They'll see a headline and a price tag and a woman at a wheel. The RIB leaped over a swell. The figures aboard wore vests and authority. Lev's phone buzzed again. He read and swore into his knuckles. The emergency order was granted at 6:05. They have paper. Paper is heavier near shore, Syra said. Out here, it floats. She throttled back to reduce wake. The RIB closed and came alongside with competent grace. A man with a megaphone spoke in the tone of a person who had drilled this speech until it had displaced his ability to speak any other way. Research vessel Argo 7, this is the United States Coast Guard. Heave to. Prepare to be boarded. Syra nodded to Leviticus let them. Mara snapped her head toward Syra, surprise and suspicion warring. We're just going to. Trust, Syra said, and Mara, after a moment that was a week long, nodded. 2 Coast Guardsmen and 1 woman with the bearing of a lieutenant came aboard. Their boots found the deck with a promise not to slip. The lieutenant's eyes did their fast, competent tour and returned to Syra's face. Captain, the lieutenant said. I'm Lieutenant Aaron Vance. We've received an order to impound your vessel and secure hazardous materials pending adjudication. Syra inclined her head. You can inspect anything you like. She gestured to the lab. But step into my house with respect. Lieutenant Vance nodded once. It was not hospitality, but it was not its opposite. She followed Syra into the lab, took in the core, the freezer, the moon pool with intelligent concern. What are your AUVs doing? Vance asked. Mapping a seep and taking photogrammetry of a passive lattice, Syra said. And because the truth is a weapon if you know how to hold it, she added, they're also carrying encrypted copies of data that a court order can compel me to produce but cannot erase. Vance's mouth twitched. She looked at Lev, noted the lawyer at bow-tie distance even without the tie. You understand the order applies to all physical samples and instruments. I do, Syra said. And I will comply with custody for the physical items aboard. The AUVs are presently in the water performing operations that, if interrupted, will result in loss of scientific value and potentially a hazard to navigation if they panic. Do they panic? Vance asked, deadpan. Only when shouted at, Syra said. The lieutenant hid a smile and a professional blink. She radioed something quiet and coded. Orders like tides washed through unseen rooms. When she looked back, her eyes were level. The order stands. But I have discretion on immediate risk. Finish your current line. Then surface the vehicles. We will take custody when they're aboard. Syra nodded. Agreed. She watched the core. The lines completed like 2 laces being tied by obedient ghosts. Lotus 1, Lotus 2, surface. On the screen, Vehicle 1, ascending. Vehicle 2, ascending. The water in the moon pool trembled. Lotus 1 popped into view like a seal answering a trainer who had not yet earned it. Syra hooked it with a gaff and slid it onto the cradle with practiced tenderness. Lotus 2 followed, dripping letters into the pool that meant nothing and everything. Power down, Syra commanded softly. The AUVs obeyed. Vance watched with something close to admiration. "You make it look like art." "It is," Syra said. Carl appeared in the doorway with zip ties and the buggy desire to be helpful. Lev shot him a look that said, "Not that kind of help." Vance lifted a hand. "We'll handle the securing," she said. "Counselor, you can observe chain of custody." Lev nodded, all calm and record-keeping. Mara stood near the freezer like a temple guardian. Vance gestured, and one of her men approached with a sealed evidence case. They lifted a cassette with tongs that revealed respect for both law and cold. Labels were read into a camera, times announced, gloves changed with an orthodoxy that would subdue arguments later like blankets over fire. "Captain," Vance said quietly as the chain of custody ceremony continued, "you've just saved me a lot of paperwork by not trying to run." "Running is for people who still believe they can get far," Syra said. "I believe I can get correct." Vance looked at her for a long beat. "I hope the court believes that too." They escorted the Argo 7 back under a soft gray sky that had decided to be kind to nobody. On the pier, a small procession waited like a weather report. University representatives in windbreakers that apologized for their budgets. A man from the Attorney General's office pretending not to be cold. A woman in a black suit whose heels made small precise declarations against the concrete. And at the end, an older man with a cardboard sign that read Marathi Forever, the letters drawn in a hand that shook. "Who's that?" Syra asked. Mara followed her gaze. "That's Farzad," she said. "Lala's father." He held the sign higher when he saw the ship. The transfer of custody became a choreography so finicky that it tried to erase the memory of the ocean. Papers passed. Seals were applied to doors that had never been asked to wear jewelry. The freezer was moved with dollies that squeaked self-importance. The AUVs were tagged like animals who had not yet decided whether to forgive humans. Farzad approached the foot of the gangway, hat twisted in his hands, and called, "Which one of you is Syra?" Syra stepped to the rail. "I am." He squinted up, tears making mirrors. "My daughter wrote your name." The pier fell quiet in the way a complicated room does when the one sentence that matters arrives. "She wrote," Farzad continued, voice steadying with muscle earned over months, "if something happens, and because she was my child, she knew something always can, give Syra the keys. She will make the right enemies." He lifted a small envelope. It had been folded and unfolded a dozen times and still believed in itself. Vance glanced at the lawyers. Lev lifted a palm that asked for decency. The woman in black heels found her empathy and looked away so no one could accuse her of lending it. Syra came down to meet Farzad on the pier. He pressed the envelope into her palm with the ceremony of a marriage. Inside, there was a thumb drive, a scrap of notebook paper with a hand-drawn lotus, and a sentence in a scientist's precise script. "If they try to bury the garden, plant it everywhere." Syra closed her fingers around the drive like it could warm her. "Thank you," she said, and it felt like not enough and also like the first true thing she had said that day. Farzad nodded, sorrow like a lighthouse behind his eyes. "Make the right enemies." The next week was a war fought on paper, filed in rooms where the windows did not open. Lev camped in courthouses, his arguments so carefully reasoned they could have cut hair. The university insisted on stewardship, the estate demanded ethical use, the state wanted to make sure nobody embarrassed it. Vance wrote a report so dry it almost caught fire from its own friction, yet in 3 places, a human being peeked through and a single adverb rescued a truth. Syra returned to the Argo 7 each morning like a lover who had been forgiven without being asked. The Coast Guard allowed her maintenance visits under supervision. She polished, inventoried, memorized. Mara came when she could, her hands always finding wires, her voice low when she spoke Lala's name. Carl quit Oceanic Asset Recovery and took a job at the yard sweeping and fetching with a pride that made Syra bring him pastries he pretended not to appreciate. Farzad came every other day with a thermos of tea. He sat on a crate and told stories about a girl who had once disassembled a blender to see what rhythm weighed. Behind the scenes, Syra planted the garden everywhere. The thumb drive held not data but maps, a list of coordinates for other SEEP sites Lale had suspected but never tested. Syra wrote scripts for Lotus 1 and Lotus 2, instructions elegant and cruel to any plan that wanted a monopoly. She released the vehicles at night where the harbor breath did not break the water's skin and whispered, "Go. Learn. Send it to 10, to 100, to those who have water to clean and bones to mend." The AUVs responded like two bright children raised by a good mother, fast, careful, disobedient only to bad orders. The hearing ended on a Wednesday that felt like a Sunday. The judge, a woman with hair like a gray flag of truce, ruled that the physical assets would remain under state custody until a joint stewardship agreement between the estate and the university could be drafted. In the meantime, data use for humanitarian projects would be permitted under a provisional license overseen by a special master. Lev squeezed Syra's shoulder in the hallway. "It's a win that tastes like compromise. My favorite dish." Vance passed by, offered a nod that contained in its geometry a small personal pride. The woman in black heels told Syra in a voice like polished wood, "You made powerful friends today." "I prefer the right enemies," Syra said. Mara smiled. That night, Syra returned to the Argo 7 alone. The ship exhaled when she stepped aboard, the way old houses do when the person who understands their noises returns. She went to the lab and sat by the moon pool, legs dangling, listening to water breathe. She thought of Lale. She thought of the ocean as a thing that forgives only those who don't ask. The core idled with a screensaver that looked like a heartbeat reduced to code. The freezer hummed law-abiding hymns. The AUVs were on their cradles, innocent and smug. Syra smiled for the first time that day without apology. And then lights she had not seen before, small, mean, flickered under the moon pool. Red, like a little mouth swearing. A shape bumped a lip, patient, impersonal. She leaned forward, breath held. The shape resolved into an AUV she did not own. Same bead-blasted titanium, same Lotus silhouette, but with a different serial etched into its nose cone, Lotus Gamma. It rested there, humming, and then its status LED blinked a very deliberate pattern. Syra counted, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, pause. It was not random. It was a handshake. It was a code she did not know, and yet recognized in the bones of her fingers. Behind it, deeper in the moon pool's throat, another red eye blinked awake. Syra stood slowly, heart finding its old panic and trying it on as if it were a dress it had worn once and never forgot. "Hello," she said to the water, and the water answered by lifting a little more, as if something vast had just moved beneath the hull. Lotus Gamma knocked against the lip of the pool again. It wasn't trying to come aboard. It was asking to be let in. Syra glanced at the core. On the bottom corner of the screen, a line of text printed itself in a font she had learned to associate with inevitability. "Remote access request, Muradi Network." She looked back at the water where more faint red pulses stitched a pattern like a constellation finding itself. The garden, she realized, wasn't a place on a map. It was a network, awake and hungry, seated before Lala's death and now coming home to ask a question. Syra set her hand on the console and took a breath that tasted like salt in pursuit. "Okay," she whispered to a woman who was gone and to an ocean that never would be. "Show me what you grew without us. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications."